Hello there, and welcome to Star Wars Music Minute, where we celebrate the music and sound of Star Wars 5 cinematic minutes at a time. I'm Chrysanthi Tan, you can call me Xanthi, and my goal with this podcast is not to present a definitive analysis of the score, but rather to explore how we feel about the score in the context of the film as a whole, with all of the other elements at play. That said, today's episode is based on minutes 146 through 150 of Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi. In other words, it's 5 full minutes of credits. Today, I'm joined by a guest that I've wanted to have on since day one. This is music theorist and film musicologist Frank Lehman. I am
Thank you.
beyond
Thank
excited to
you.
have you.
It's a thrill to be here, and I've watched this project evolve, and it's so impressive. I've told you that you've managed to make it to the end of the movie and kept the level of insight and attention to detail pretty consistently high. So, bravo to you.
Thank you. Well, to be fair, going 5 minutes at a time sort of demands a level of detail that would
Right.
otherwise be, and that was so actually sort of like one of the reasons I was really excited to do this show is I'm a Star Wars fan first, despite being a musician, like I'm a fan first, and I usually stay away from doing like musical analysis of Star Wars. In fact, the only Star Wars soundtrack album I've owned is Phantom Menace, and I guess I co-owned that with my brother growing up. So that's the only one I've owned. I'm not someone who listens to the like for your consideration albums before the movie comes out, and I try to shield myself from the music as much as possible so that I can go in like as a fan first and just have that experience, and then I don't even listen to the soundtrack afterward. I just like have to let the whole film sink in.
Mhm. I
And
know exactly
yeah.
what you mean. I guess I'm coming from it from a different perspective in that I would say I'm probably music first and Star Wars fan second, although it is hard to extricate those two things because they both set in as I was growing up, the sort of mutual love of the franchise and of music in general, and specifically Williams's music. Um, I do have more than one Star Wars soundtrack. I've got about, I don't know, it's off camera, but there's like 200 or so John Williams CDs at arm's length right now. Like, so
Oh my gosh. That's
as
amazing.
you know, like there's a kind of collector mentality that is behind analysis, and I have that going on for sure.
And I'm glad that people like you exist because you enable me when I'm like ready to dip my toes into it. You enable me to do that more easily. So for those listening, you know that I recommend Frank Lehman's complete catalog of the musical themes of Star Wars pretty much every episode. And Frank, like I use your like even though of course the naming of leitmotifs is relatively subjective, and like I'll have guests that call things by different names, but we're talking about the same thing.
Mhm.
Because I appreciate how just internally consistent your catalog is. I use your like I'm fully on board with like your namings. I just
Well,
feel like I want to follow in, like you've already set something up that's so nice. Like
mm,
there's no need to reinvent reinvent the wheel on my part.
well, that really means a lot to me, and I can tell you that the motivation for creating this, I mean, first of all, it was just a passion project and a personal little catalog or inventory, as I imagine a lot of people who've listened to these movies over the years have created. But I saw that there was a need and an interest in something a little bit more systematic and a little bit more internally consistent, as you say. So if that's what I can offer, all the better. The issue is that what began as a one-page long, basically like Excel spreadsheet, is now what, like 60 odd pages, and it will continue to grow. Like I have some plans that will ensure that this thing is never truly complete. It's called the Complete Catalog, but it's always a work in progress.
Well, it's almost complete because it's a work in progress, like by definition,
Yeah.
which I think is like one of the really cool things about it. Like it's not, maybe it's just a function of being in 2021 or whatever year people are listening to this, but the if that were in a book, like I just almost wouldn't even look at it. Like I would almost not. What if it were 2 years old? Then I
Well,
like,
that's exactly the problem, in fact, with the version of this catalog, which is indeed in a book.
oh my
This
gosh.
kind of preliminary version. I don't know if you can quite see that in this
Yeah.
wonderful edited volume, John Williams' Music for Films, Television, and the Concert Stage. Emilio Odesino, who's like the expert on John Williams, he helped edit this. And he proposed, what was like in 2016 or so, like right after Force Awakens came out, he asked me if there's anything I'd like to contribute to this. I said, I've been sort of working on a pretty informal at this point catalog of the themes of Star Wars and something I've been interested in, and I could produce a chapter on that. But even with the slowness of academic publishing, it was, this came out before Rise of Skywalker, so it is incomplete. It only has the themes up to The Last Jedi. And of course, I've learned a lot about all 9 film scores since then too. So if you do get the print version in the book, yeah, it's going to be totally obsolete. It is totally obsolete.
Well, listeners, good news. It's actually available on Frank Lehman's website for free, franklehman.com/Star Wars. So, it's not necessary to listen to this episode to have that. But if you want peak nerd synchronicity, you might as well go to that right now and check it out. Even if you don't read music, I would say, scroll all the way to the appendix. Maybe there are a few really cool references, like there's graphs and there's like the thematic census and just a few other things. I mean, I think even if you don't read music, I think even just reading through it will be interesting.
Yeah, and it isn't a curious challenge, and it's one that you probably face too in communicating sometimes pretty sophisticated musical insights in a way that's still accessible. And there's a compromise. I include music notation because I think it's really of value to a lot of people, and I get messages from folks saying, "Oh, I've just been improvising on your chord reductions of these themes," and so if you can access it in that way, that's great. But more and more, I think text level descriptions or these sort of overall summaries of what's happening in a movie musically are there's a value in that too. So my direction is going to be in going forward probably more accessibility and more that can speak to a musical non-expert.
That is it's such a difficult line to tread. And well, you teach, you're a professor, so you have you have a certain level of, I guess, rigor and sort of, do you teach music students? Yeah.
I mean, all levels, undergrads and master's students and PhD students coming up too. And but even at the university level, I mean, I love to teach. I taught a course on John Williams actually during the pandemic, or like it was interrupted by the pandemic in the spring of last year. And this was meant entirely for non-musicians, people who maybe weren't even able to read music. And the useful thing I think about this particular repertoire and film music in general is that it's so vivid that even if you don't have that robust knowledge of scales and chord types and everything, there's a lot that you can understand if it's explained in a sort of accessible and sensitive way. So I love communicating with non-experts because that's kind of what film music is supposed to do in the first place. It's not meant to be this is like me going against my whole life story. You know what I mean, though. It's
okay. You can tell me because I'm absolutely definitely not. I'm not in education. I'll put it that way. And I feel like it's still, though, I am constrained by knowing what I know about music and struggle sometimes to I try to remove myself from that as much as possible. And I appreciate that there are people who are firmly in in the academy. I don't know, what am I calling it? In institutions that can do, I don't know, the rigor and the level of, I don't know, basically hold the study of film music and everything to a certain standard. And I'm trying to say that not in a standard of that it's a better way of looking at it, but sort of what I meant with your catalog, with a sense of consistency, a sense of someone else can trace the steps.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. At the same time, I think it's also really important to be able to communicate, and not just communicate to people who don't have a formal music background, but also to be able to like listen from them, like be
Hmm.
able to source their feelings. And something that I come across a lot, and you must too, is that people are sometimes afraid to talk to me about music, or Star Wars fans will seek my opinion on music, basically in order to provide a valid music theoretical explanation for an emotional truth that they already feel.
Hmm.
Sort of like it will validate, and that is something like that is a big driver for doing this show too, and having a lot of guests from different backgrounds is like I definitely want to make it clear, because like it kind of just is like a pet peeve of mine, looking at all of the hot takes that are everywhere, and all the like all of
Oh,
like and like a lot of like YouTube as well, where it's like you just like drop in a few bits of music theory knowledge, and suddenly it like proves why the thing you love is already the best. And like I can't stand that, but it's also really hard to convince someone that like even though I know more than you, like in this particular
mhm.
way, I genuinely like you might y- that doesn't like no amount of my formal justification can justify your how you feel about something.
Yeah, that totally rings true, and it's understandable that people both totally novice musicians and folks like you and me who actually have a pretty um, immense knowledge of music. Both of us, we're all susceptible to sort of finding evidence of some sort to support our musical or narrative intuitions, and that's okay in some ways. I mean, there's certainly danger to find what you're looking for no matter
Mm-hmm.
what, and that's something I try to keep in mind very assiduously as I go about constructing this catalog, because the temptation is pick out a few notes here and there and say, aha, this supports my theory about who Ray's father is, whatever. you know
Oh my
you
gosh,
wouldn't
theoretic
you wouldn't
conversations.
believe the amount of speculation and sort of wild theorization that,
Yeah.
of course, the filmmakers and to a certain extent even Williams and the other musicians involved in the series, they cultivate a fevered sense of wanting to figure things out and leave musical clues or things that are open ended that can be interpreted multiple ways. And there, the role of the analyst is very tricky, right? Because you want to be able to say some things that are like objectively true, but
Mm-hmm.
you never necessarily know the mind of the composer or the screenwriters. They might not know their own mind in some ways, and there's a degree of you know uh, um, accident for
As a
sure.
composer myself, I can say that like the amount of scrutiny that like goes into John Williams' thought process really makes me
Mhm.
sit back and go like,
Woo.
that's not how the creative process works.
Yeah.
Because like the answer is often like not that, like there are utilitarian reasons for things, but
Mhm.
also that doesn't mean that they're not also inspired by multiple directions. I
Well,
mean,
absolutely, yeah. And we know something about his process. We know that uh, he has a good memory, but sometimes he forgets themes, or based on whatever happens on the cutting room floor. Various versions of cues may never be heard, or a director may not ask him to use a theme, even if it had been appropriate. Like for example, Rose's theme in
right,
Rise
that's
of
not in the Rise of
Skywalker.
Skywalker.
Not nope, at least not in any of the music that we've heard. I mean,
Yeah.
there is music that is sort of like out there that maybe was performed that no one has heard besides Williams and the people on the studio soundstage. But um, yeah, so it would be tempting maybe to hunt through the score for the Rise of Skywalker to find just that pair or three notes that used my detective ear to discover the Hidden Roses theme, right? Because then I could give a check for it in the catalog, and it would say, "Ah, Williams is
Oh my god.
so he's so consistent." But yeah, that's not how it works, and
No.
it's full of accidents, and that doesn't, I don't think, diminish the value of the music in any way either. That's just how it works, right? And there are oftentimes very happy accidents that occur in these scores.
Yes, I want to go back to something you said about um, that there have. some like determining what's objectively true versus an interpretation or
Mhm.
opinion. And I think that's something that I try to go back to ground, I don't know, the way that I think about things, because there are certain things formally that we can say simply are true. Whether, like, for example, like in your catalog as a reference, like one could say, like, if you notice one thing that is like another, you could say, like, yes, Rey's theme, for example, has the same first three notes as the Emperor's theme. You could, that is objectively true.
Mhm.
Now, where you go next with your line of thinking, that
Mhm.
is not true. That is, now you are in the realm of opinion interpretation, and that's all. And also, since Williams himself doesn't often like confirm this stuff,
Mhm.
um, then that's another, that's even more reason to tread lightly.
Very.
Not that you should tread lightly in your own interpretation, because I think that's like the cool thing about literature and art and music is like you cobble together your own meaning, and that's great.
Yeah.
It's only a problem if you then present your interpretation as fact by justifying it with formal truths, like
Mhm.
they're the same first three notes, because then that missing piece in the middle is,
Mhm.
but does that necessarily lead to that? And that's where, like, when you start introducing too much like music talk, like people can get lost and be swayed to
Yeah.
just come to your same opinion.
Yeah, right. It's like a magical power you mystify by using this technical jargon, and it causes your other people's critical faculties to kind of be lowered. So it's dangerous. And the sort of history of my work on Star Wars has been increasingly adding disclaimers and caveats about just that thing that you mentioned. That uh, you know we often don't have direct evidence or even indirect evidence that a lot of the wonderful connections between themes or what have you were intentional. That doesn't mean it's not meaningful. And I'm it's thrilling. I would imagine Williams is thrilled if he knew that people were sort of doing theory crafting based on the slightest bits, nuggets of information from his movie scores. That can be intensely personally meaningful, but you have to be careful not to clothe it in that language of objectivity, and maybe unearned authority. One of the motivators for creating this catalog, among many, was seeing that online there is that tendency to come up with ever more elaborate hot takes involving music. And here's something that I thought, well, with my training as a music theorist, one of the few places on earth where the training of a music theorist may actually have some kind of public value would be, to maybe direct some of these observations in a way that, at least is coming from someone who, uh, I don't know if I'm right, but I do know the music pretty well. And I also have some sense of the limitations of film scoring and the deadlines and the horizons of attention, and all those things that might make for a little bit less of a perfect theory. I can perhaps add some sort of caveat to that effect. People read it, that's okay. If they don't, well, at least it's out there.
Yeah. There's, I'm sure we'll circle back to this uh, particular discussion at many points, but in this credit suite or credit scene, what is going on in it? Okay, they're like, we're getting a parade of different themes,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. Um, what do you make of it?
It's really quite extraordinary, in the Star Wars canon, that there is such a dense, thematically dense end credit sequence. Um, I mean, the end credits always have been a major focal point for the music in these movies. Like, that's where a lot of Williams' attention has been directed. That's where you get generally like the long spanning statements of themes and something that's allowing the music just to shine on its own. And that's true of the Last Jedi, for sure. But what I think distinguishes this in this particular portion of the credits in particular is just that the sheer stuffedness of it, that I think
Yes.
for like on a minute to minute level, there's probably more motifs here than any other end credits suite. Just like there's kind of like high, very high level background level of motivic density across the episode eight's score as a whole. And add to that there are different versions of the end credits, and that quite a bit of it is coming from underscore, right? It's coming not from newly written arrangements of themes, but rather from
Yeah, like some of
adapted.
it seems like it's from the Battle of Crate. Some of it
Yeah,
seems like it's
absolutely.
from and some of it seems like it's from Luke's whole solo moment on Octo.
Yeah, yeah, it's kind of a hodgepodge, and I think that opinions are within the little micro discourse that is John Williams' end credits evaluation culture. Like the opinion is divided as to whether this is successful or not. I actually think
What
that
does
it's
that mean? What does that mean for it to be
well,
successful?
well, the standard that all the Star Wars end credits are judged against, I think, is Empire Strikes Back. Maybe A New Hope, but definitely Empire Strikes Back
Okay.
because that has just this phenomenal end credits suite, which starts off like they all do with the main theme and Rebel fanfare, but then goes into this really cool, energetic new statement, new arrangement of Yoda's theme, followed by an incredibly powerful statement of the Imperial March that transitions in a seamless and very powerful way into Han Solo and the Princess, and there again is a new version and is all capped off with a brand new coda. It's just like the most satisfying formally, musically, of all the end credits, and it's all new music, or for the most part, new music. It's not stuff that you hear like during the main diegesis. Um, and with that in mind, I guess people might say that The Last Jedi is more scattered, right? It doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily have that same feeling of unity, of recalling each theme and giving it space to breathe. On the other hand, I think it's very exciting music, and actually does have this kind of interesting emotional arc that has ebbs and flows and some really, really powerful moments, like Leia's theme, for example.
I wonder
That
if like the addition of that Carrie Fisher in memory of thing it's sort of disjointed. I don't know. It sort of is inserted right there at the beginning of the
yeah,
credits. I don't know.
I, that's I think that's right. It does. I mean, it's a brief moment, and but it draws attention to itself by virtue of the theme and the text, of course, but also the fact that we're hearing on the piano, which is really a rare instrument in
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna
Wars.
let me play it. Let me play this. Okay. Go into it. So here we have Rose. And so now we're on to Luke. This is Luke in Exile, the fanfare. Yeah. And then we're going to go right into the Saraband. So a little bit abruptly, but they're related. So yeah, the end credits, I mean, the Leia's theme being on piano, I wonder if John Williams played that. Pardon me.
That's a great question. Well, we know that he was the one who played the
Belonged.
piano, yeah, in Rise of Skywalker.
Oh, and he also played in the Canto Bite scene,
Oh
A
yeah,
Long
yeah,
Goodbye. Yeah.
yeah. So it might well be him. That actually seems fairly plausible. I mean, there's also, of course, a studio pianist who'd be
Yeah.
more than
I'll
happy
ask a
to.
couple people.
So yeah, I don't know, but that could be an additional, really poignant detail. Um, as far as I know, that Leia cameo, the thematic cameo, was not in the original conception of the end credits when it was added a little bit later. And there are two versions of it too. This another version, I think the first version is just a tiny bit more extended, so it
Mm, mm.
sounds quite
The Leia portion.
yeah, the Leia portion. It seems quite brief in this iteration. It lasts basically as long as the in memory of Carrie Fisher card does on the screen. So, but Williams, yeah, he tinkered with this end credit suite a lot. Like everything with this score. I mean, there's signs of the amount of tinkering all across the movie, and that's, I think, apparent in the end credits too. And that doesn't, I don't think that necessarily detracts from its power. Um, you could compare it with The Force Awakens, which had, um, I think that was the first time that we had real action music, like an action set piece, as part of the as part of the end credit scene, where they had the sort of Poe plus Finn motifs happening simultaneously.
Was that the
Uh,
scherzo for X-Wing?
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah. Whereas Last Jedi, it's even more action music, right? Within this span, we got Battle of Crate, different legs of the Battle of Crate. We have, the part that has the TIE fighter attack. In earlier versions, there's a ton of the initial escape section and music based on it, and there's aspects of that sort of Luke in Exile music that is also pretty up tempo and somewhat anxious too. So it's really quite a cornucopia of musical material, right? It truly does encapsulate the whole score. Like there's
Yeah.
very little that's relevant thematically that isn't somewhere in some version of the end credits from episode 8.
I'm gonna keep I'm gonna keep playing a little bit of it, and then maybe we can talk about the first part of the end credit. So we're still. This is Luke in Exile. That's the name that Frank Lehman has called this motif in the catalog. So if you recall the Luke's music video section. So he's like about to pole vault across the cliffs. This is what's happening here. It's raining. Okay, changes there, so not quite that. So we're kind of still in this, like, I wouldn't say it's like necessarily just one chord, but like, put it this way. As a violinist, when I perform with my looping pedal, I often try to like play things, or when I start improvising over, like, I don't have that many loops in my traveling setup. So like I will put down a loop of a chord, and I often put down a drone or something, and then play things that can layer on top of that really easily in the same key, or like, or surrounding the same drone note or whatever. I could easily put in both of Luke's new Luke and Exile themes. Could put in all of Ray's stuff.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things would really fit into that.
Yeah, and I don't think it's an accident that those themes work well with each other. There was a bit of a challenge to figure out what to call that material when the
Luke's new
movie
stuff.
first came out. Yeah, I think what I was going off was a interview he did with John Burlingame, where, as very briefly, Burlingame says that Williams said that there's a new theme for Rose and music for Luke's island, or Luke on his island, and some other material, right? So that at least suggested to me that the two main new thematic ideas for Last Jedi were Rose's theme on one hand and Luke on Octo and some
Mm-hmm.
configuration the other. And then because there are those two different ideas, right, the sort of slower versus, right, the up tempo and the down tempo versions, they're very closely related, even if they have a different vibe to them. So I
Yeah.
kind of slotted them into the same category, even
Mm-hmm.
if they're not strictly the same. And they get attention in the end credits, in some ways more attention than they
Yeah.
actually get
Yeah.
during the main movie, where it's there. I mean, it is a leitmotif. It's developed a little bit, but it's not like a force theme. This is very constrained. But Williams grants it pretty much a concert arrangement, or at least half of a concert arrangement. The Rebellion is Reborn / Rose's Turn, as I think it's called in the cue sheet. Like that's interesting in its own right, a kind of hybrid concert arrangement of two different themes, Rose plus Luke. And that's the banner new musical offering from The Last Jedi. And that all, well, not all of it, a lot of it comes from these end credits, right? He uses the music that he wrote in the end credits, which is already a little bit more self-contained, and he adds a beginning and end and maybe, some new climaxes, and then, sends it off to Hal Leonard or whatever he does.
I think when we actually hear the Luke and Exile themes for the first time, which is like, I remember it was in minutes 20 through 25. I only know that from doing the show. I feel like the way that it's presented makes, even though it only appears like really that once, the way it's presented makes it feel really important because it's presented without dialogue. This is like
And in a
Luke getting to
longer,
show off for 5 minutes his new self.
yeah,
And
it's a montage.
it's actually like probably like I think it's my favorite new music from this film. I love Luke's new themes. And I don't, I have my own biases of like what things I tend to like, and so maybe, I'm sure that all plays into it, but like I just really really like it.
And
Yeah.
and it does. It's also kind of a follow up in some ways from Jedi Steps.
I was just going to say that. Yep.
Yeah, it's not identical melodically, but there's certain similar harmonies and these suspension or suspended chords. It's of a kind, and
I love Jedi Steps.
they can kind of phase in with one another.
Okay.
It's just it's very evocative and interesting, maybe unexpected music too for the context.
Okay. So I have an A minor chord. Obnoxiously, being an obnoxious violinist. So we go like. Go like. Right? That's how. We could also go. What did I do? Oh, I get confused. Which one have I done?
Right?
So far, this is like Jedi Steps, both of Luke and Exile. We also have.
Yeah, all three of Rey's themes, I think, are closely, maybe even to the point where one was inspired by the other, related to Luke and Exile. It's in exactly the same musical universe.
And this is where my speculation comes in. This is like, okay, this is where those are facts. Now, the opinion part and how I make meaning of it, because like as a Star Wars fan first, is, well, I'm primed to like Luke and Exile's theme because I'm fully on board with Luke being in exile in the first place. And I think it's like actually really powerful that we get completely new material for him rather than like some sort of a deformation of his existing theme. Like I think that would have been, I wouldn't have liked that as much, I think, if we got like just the main theme, but like in a weird way. Yeah. I like that it's something new and it's like, it feels like committed. And also the main hallmark of Rey's theme, like from the first time I saw The Force Awakens, is just how open-ended it is. Like, the Jakku melody is sort of like open in the like pentatonic type of way. Like it actually reminds me of like Dvorak New World Symphony. And it just leaves a lot of notes that you could fill in. And Luke's Exile theme and Rey's themes, like if you go back to like that moment of the movie when Luke is saying like, no, I'm not going to train you, go away, and he makes her follow him around on the island, and so fans will often say like, why did he do that, like he's rejecting her, like this is kind of like a pathetic moment. And however, here we actually hear like Luke and Exile themes, and then we hear Rey's theme sort of mixed into that. like it sort of goes back and forth in those minutes. So like I think it in that moment it shows sort of how to me how their paths actually are like more parallel than Luke is willing to see at the moment. And then through both of them, the Force theme can run.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
like I see that like I see like such a clear like if people want to read a Palpatine connection, you could
Hmm.
also just as easily read like she's so tied to Luke thematically
Hmm.
too. But you know, every theme is like 6 degrees of separation, 1 degree
Yeah.
of separation from the next. So like this is my reading of it, but I think it really makes sense to me in that way.
Oh yeah, and I think it's also supported in some ways. Like Williams does corroborate that connection, especially during the brief little training scene where she's dueling with a rock, and you actually hear I don't know if it's
Oh
succession
yeah.
or
Yeah.
overlaying of the Exile fanfare and race chimes
Oh
and stuff.
yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's the connection that Williams is drawing your attention to. Whereas other things, like well, the Palpatine connection, if that truly were intentional, and if the powers that be wanted it to be heard that way, you would probably have heard some sort of Palpatine-esque version of Rey's theme, at least in Rise of Skywalker. We don't get that really, so that kind of puts to bed some speculation.
But at the same time, you could read into it and that could totally like you know how we as fans like to so like retcon things or whatever. And it's not necessarily like a bad thing. Like Star Wars
No.
is something where like the accumulation of new knowledge in
Mm.
deepens the connection to the previous content. Like and so it sort of works backward in that way. So if someone wanted to um take Ray's theme and say like how neat that like it was open ended enough that like it
Mhm.
ended up being able to like I can draw this really uh powerful connection because it just lent itself to that, which says nothing about intention, but like
Mhm.
interpretation. Like if that means something to you, that's
Well,
fine. That's great.
there's something is maybe is a little ill-defined, but there is an intentional aspect to writing music that is open-ended and suggestive in that way, like and I mean a very mythically specific way, in that you can sort of draw these connections that are buried and personal, without necessarily having it be textual, like all subtextual and all sort of open ended, as you said. And a good example that occurs to me is actually the very end of Rise of Skywalker, the A New Home cue, which we see Ray. I refuse to call her Ray Skywalker. Ray Nobody on Tatooine.
Oh
And
my
the
god.
music it is ostensibly a new theme, very beautiful and sort of dark and desolate, with a hint of raised chimes explicitly at one point. But if you sort of go and listen to it a little more carefully, some of the key relationships and harmonies and just melodic contours, there's so much other Star Wars music in that unique piece of finale music for Episode 9. I mean, I hear Jedi Steps for sure. I hear the Force theme. I hear bits maybe of the Imperial March. Heck, I even hear bits of Shmi's funeral music from Episode 2, which I can promise you Williams was not thinking about. And I highly suspect that it wasn't temp tracked with that either. So there's really no direct intentionality. Rather, it's music that embodies this kind of um, uh, uh, mythic past and contains enough musical signifiers of pastness and epicness and significance that then we as listeners who are one way or another familiar with this repertoire and this corpus of themes can draw our own connections and make our, and that's great. And I think, yeah, absolutely Williams means to do that. Whether or not he's literally like looking over his score to Episode 2 saying, I'm going to throw in this tiny little musical Easter egg that only 3 people on Twitter are going to notice, that's unlikely. Not impossible, but unlikely. But this more generalized kind of um, productive vagueness, I guess you could call it, to the music is actually like that's part of the Star Wars musical style. Really is.
There also is this a subconscious um, aspect of it where even if it is not intentionally signified, it could be so like subconsciously part of his way of
Oh,
writing and just being and this way he some part of him that he's not even conscious of remembers. And I
yeah.
think that's like I think about
Well,
the scene in The Last Jedi when Snoke is doing the thing to Rey and we hear the Emperor's theme.
Mm-hmm.
And in retrospect, like I watched that and I was like, oh my God.
Whoa,
Wow,
giddy
we straight up hear the Emperor's theme right there. Whoa. And then like the guest that I had on the show that week we were talking about like, okay, what's going on there? Like why do we hear the Emperor's theme there? And my take on it is whether or not John Williams knew, which he didn't know, but like even if he did know, whether he knew or not is irrelevant. Like whether anyone knew or not is irrelevant because can't you, what, isn't it totally plausible that even if the emperor is totally dead and gone, like his legacy is still like, honestly, Snoke,
Yeah.
even though Snoke is, a new figure, he's still like totally emperor vibing it out. Like he's still continuing in the same, like, the same non-ethic, like he's still operating in the same vein, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So like, it's
Yeah.
completely understandable that like the legacy of the emperor is still there, and that would
Oh, for
be
goodness, yeah.
totally sufficient as an explanation.
It's absolutely sufficient, and it probably was the justification at the time that either Williams or Ryan Johnson said, why don't, just for old time's sake, we throw in a brief nod to this wonderful, you know, cackling evil theme, and it'll make sense, emotionally for sure, and it also makes sense on a kind of thematic level, thematic like a narrative sense, because here's a bad guy wielding the force to torture a good guy. Um, and it's only retroactively that it becomes a seemingly I just say a very felicitous use of one particular leitmotif. Otherwise, there's not a whole lot of connection with the Emperor's material or the Emperor's theme. I mean, all the Snoke material, as you probably already know, is like slow male choir, and that's all part of the dark side constellation of musical signifiers anyway. Uh, but yeah, that particular moment in Last Jedi, like that's the least concerning as far as weird thematic choices go. I wasn't bothered by that, or even
Oh,
really
we did.
scratching my head when I was just happy to hear that theme, um, compared to with say use of Luke and Leia's theme in Rise of Skywalker when
I'll have to have you on
Lando.
when I do that movie too.
Yeah, yeah. Then we can talk about Lando kind of hitting on his maybe this sort of incestuous love theme between brother and
Oh
sister.
goodness.
I mean, it's emotionally appropriate, right there, as the Emperor's theme was during the Last Jedi. And at the end of the day, I mean, the semantics of the music has to take a backseat to what it's conveying on an expressive level. And with the Emperor's theme, it's creepy, dark, magical sounding music, so it's going to fit. And same thing kind of goes for the sort of familial, romantic, sibling-ish music for Lando and Janna, because it's a touching, poignant moment, and it's about family, and the music fits there. So yeah, I try not to get too hung up on these things. I mean, sometimes it does frustrate me, but it's for the most part, again, it's just part of the way this music works, and it's always been that way, right? It's not just Star Wars, but other movie scores and opera and musical theater, and there's always a little selective tactical inconsistency, as you could say.
So I confess, or I mean, I don't feel bad about it, so I guess it's not a confession. But like, I feel lucky that I don't actually feel like super encumbered by being bothered by those things, and not just with music, but like, I'm like a
Mhm.
weirdly accepting Star Wars fan. Like, I
Good
I
for you.
I also like the Rise of Skywalker, which I
Hey.
love the Last Jedi,
Mhm.
but I also like I only started having doubts about the Rise of Skywalker when I read and heard so many other opinions about it, and started letting all that other stuff in, which I understand, like I totally understand, and I haven't rewatched it since the couple times I saw it in the theater. Um, but but it would be I try not to deny like the child in me who left that theater being like, oh my God, I'm so hyped. Like,
Yeah.
I love this,
Well,
because it's easy for me to be like,
mhm.
sort of deny that I ever liked it, and to sort of jump on like the criticalness of it, because I, try to be like a critical person and try to be measured in my responses. But also, Star Wars is very precious to me. So, like, it's like one of the things that I try to preserve as much as possible. Whenever I see something or hear something that feels like surprises me, it's like it's incongruous or like that it jars me, my immediate reaction is like, what context am I missing that would justify its use?
Yeah. Well, I'll say two things. First of all, I'm kind of coming around to the Rise of Skywalker. Part of that maybe is that the plot holes or whatever you want to say, they're kind of sort of being filled in by ancillary shows like Bad Batch.
Are you watching
Really
that?
good. Oh yeah, yeah. I mean,
Oh,
we
interesting.
yeah,
Interesting.
plenty to talk about there too. But
Oh, yeah.
um, yeah, so yeah, I'm by no means a hater of
Oh, yeah.
how could I be? Because I think in some ways it's the most satisfying musically score that you could ask for. It's absolutely phenomenal. There are problems. Don't get me wrong. There are problems, but I think it's actually frustrating that people dismiss the movie and particularly dismiss the music because it is just phenomenal, and you can tell that Williams poured his heart into it. Um,
Well, that's the sort of goes back to like when people already emotionally have like a conclusion about something, then yeah, we'll just find whatever facts support that. And like if we didn't like the movie, then we're gonna find reasons why like the music also didn't make sense here. And let's find let's find all yeah.
well, Well, it also goes back to my prioritization of music over the saga per se.
Yeah.
And so even if it's a terrible
Works in your
movie,
favor
with
there.
wooden dialogue or special effects that don't age well, it's it's a musical experience for me. And in that regard, it's usually very satisfying one at that. The other thing I was going to say about picking out details that are incongruous. There's actually I've seen it theorized in musicology, particularly by Carolyn Abate, writing about opera and instrumental music from like the 19th century that has a operatic or programmatic feel to it, like The Sorcerer's Apprentice or
Hmm.
tone poems. And her idea, and I'm not exactly sure where this stems from, probably narrative theory, is that it is those moments that cannot be fit within your pre-existing narrative expectations that are the most fertile moments for generating meaning. And in fact, musical meaning comes from those moments of incongruity or markedness. Like just to give you a really simple example, like if we had a chord progression that was as vanilla as that wasn't so vanilla, like this. It's kind of tricky to assign that meaning, but if instead it did one little incongruous thing like right, ended in somewhere that's unexpected or had dissonance, like that's where we start to produce narrative. That's where we start to produce either personal meaning or some sort of collective interpretation of what, in that case, like a deceptive cadence means. And it's absolutely true for film music. Even Star Wars and even this sort of mainstreamy music where it's not supposed to draw too much, like you're not supposed to go to the movie theater and ignore what all the characters are saying and not be swept along with the narrative because you're trying to do what we're doing right now. But the music does enable that, and that's usually the most interesting stuff. And that Palpatine moment is like that could be exhibit, like the prime exhibit for exactly what you're mentioning.
I think that's another I think it's a positive aspect of sort of going through the films 5 minutes at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because there will be like long stretches where it's underscore that you can barely hear,
Mm-hmm.
which in the context of the film, like without, listening to the soundtrack or, listening to the commercial releases and everything, you can hear all the music, as the star,
Mm-hmm.
and that's fine. But when you see how it is functioning in the in the movie, like then you start to, I mean, at least I start to really appreciate the moments where it does come up, and then like also appreciate the silences, and sort of it
Oh,
sort of puts everything more in perspective, like how it's all working. And
right.
um it
And
makes moments like that Luke and Exile theme stand out more than they would
mhm.
if I maybe heard the entire thing at full volume,
Right.
because it yeah, because it was interesting that there was no dialogue there.
Yeah, you can't get moments like that or Holdo's maneuver, the huge musical
Yes.
shift there without a buildup that does include much less conspicuous underscore. That on its own may or may not be equally interesting, but it's the fact that there is this contrast. It can't just be all climax. It can't just be musical set piece one after the other. We need moments that are more ambient, that are more um, setting mood. And well, and there are examples in this score, like the mirror scene and the build up to it, um,
Mm.
the raised cave. That I think it's just fascinating musically. It's not super foregrounded. Like sound obviously is super important in that scene, but it's not like based on a hummable melody or anything. And
Yeah,
it's
that's a good
very
point.
intentionally constructed, right? It's not all
Wait, I think I
forced.
have a clip of it ready.
Oh,
So I did an episode about this. Yeah. Actually, this is probably the most active part.
yeah, there's parts before and after.
Yeah.
Just these sustained, naked sounding pitches or the
He's like
bass, the contrabass clarinet gurgling around. It's wonderfully evocative. And of
gurgling,
course,
yeah. Lots of
it goes back
gurgling,
to,
buzzing, like the clustering of the
yeah. Oh,
yeah. Right. Yeah.
I mean, the music is in dialogue with the Dagobah tree scene for sure.
That's
Uh,
yep. That's what my episode is about. See?
yeah, and it's
Here's the Dagobah. Comparing them. Yeah. I mean,
there's a lot of that in the score, isn't it? You know,
there is.
sometimes not overt. There's plenty overt referentiality for sure, but um, I find that Last Jedi, maybe you talked about this a little bit. There are moments in this score that, more than anything else in the sequel trilogy, at least, refer sideways to music from the prequels.
Examples?
Like there's the pseudo quote of Battle of the Heroes at the end of the opening escape. That sort of, I forget what key it's in, but I'm going to say it's in A
It was
minor.
in I think it was in D.
It's in D. Perfect. Right? That was probably temp tracked. Right? I think that we don't have
Yeah.
evidence for it, but I think
And
it's
I
hard.
love that moment.
Oh, it's just I listened to this. This is the one thing I allowed myself to listen to before seeing the movie because the soundtrack came out a day or so beforehand. Was that opening escape sequence? And I was like, "What? This is so much more emotionally gripping than we're used to in opening scenes from Star
Oh,
Wars. Like, there's this huge. What is this tragic music that is sort of alluding to Battle of the Heroes doing? What's happening on screen? And of
and
course,
ending
it's
on like I believe does that end it ends like on a perfect authentic cadence, does it?
yeah, yeah,
Which makes it
and then,
me whenever and it also happens like toward the end of the Last Jedi
mhm,
where
mhm.
where in the context of John Williams or maybe like maybe Hollywood film scores in general, but you would know more about that than me. Like I think it's rare. I feel like it's rare to hear like an end like that.
Yes. Oh, yes. I've gotten a lot of mileage out of that observation.
Okay, cool.
I have a whole article on cadences. I mean, they are depends a little bit on the style of the movie and the era, but as a general rule, you reserve big, definitive phrase ends for the most important moments in your movie. The moments that you want to emphasize, that you want to draw sort of together all elements, storytelling, visuals, narrative, dialogues, and music, and all together in a nice coordinated package because they give you a feeling of conclusiveness, even if it's bad conclusiveness, sort of with the mixed results of the opening escape sequence. And that's also true for um, Luke's sort of astrally projected punking of Kylo Ren with the cadence that concludes that, and then oh, it's just phenomenal, right?
Yeah, that's when it happened.
They're
Okay, I'm trying
very
to.
rare, very rare.
Yeah, and hearing it just like it makes it feel very tragic.
Mm-hmm.
It's yeah.
Mhm. And it's also that's another example of music that is channeling the prequels, and particularly Episode 3 and Anakin's
Yes.
event and those, you know, again, I think it's probably
It feels like very like Passacaglia ish
oh
in
yeah,
some
yeah, yeah.
moments.
Hmm.
It's like it'll go like I don't know, I can't remember where it is. It's like somewhere in the Last Jedi. It isn't doesn't do like the Force theme. It's like I don't know. I just know that like one of the cadences
Hmm.
ends on like or like just
Yeah,
something really absurd. Like I don't know.
that's that is it's not the Force theme. It's that well, maybe there's a moment, but I think it's an E minor.
Okay.
and it's after Rey lifts the rocks, and we have
Yeah. Yeah.
Luke sort of. I think it's the moment when Luke sheathes, if that's the right word, or depowers his lightsaber, and we get that cadence. Yeah, and that is the same exact cadence as the end of the Order 66 sequence from Revenge of the Sith. I think that is 100% intentional. Maybe Williams wasn't thinking. I doubt that he remembers scoring that sequence, but Rian Johnson chose that music. I'm willing to stake money on that, to make that connection. It's like it's the death of the Jedi in one, and it's the the rebirth or the ascendance of a new Jedi in the other.
Like when I spoke to Erica Duke Kirkpatrick, cellist on these sequel trilogies, she mentioned that like when she was in the Rise of Skywalker sessions, that there was a cue they were playing called The Kiss, and she said that they were all like playing this cue, The Kiss, and then it ended like on a D minor cadence or something, and they were all just like speculating because she was like, it's called The Kiss, but it's so sad. Like,
yeah,
and
right, yeah, that doesn't end well.
Yeah, right.
For both parties, does it? Yeah,
I was like, I'm glad I wasn't. Glad I'm not on. Glad I wasn't on those scoring sessions because I would have been really upset at that spoiler.
Yeah, and you would have pieced it together just not even from the title of the cue, but probably from the tone of the music.
Just
you have Kylo Ren's theme and Rey's theme coming together and interacting in a very powerful and tragic romantic way. Definitely pick that out. So it's a good thing that we're not in the scoring sessions.
Yeah.
Goodness, we're far away from the.
No, we're still. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna keep playing. Okay. Nope. Skip forward. Okay. Because we still have to talk about Rose's. How. And now we're back. Gonna go back to Luke and Exile. Like, what's interesting is like I feel like the end credits swap between, like they switch between like Luke and Exile, Rose, like, and Rose feels like almost like a transitional, like Rose provides, I don't know, like some harmonic transition to the next spots. Like here's a better spot of Rose. So there she provides the transition to the March of the Resistance.
Although that is the cap to the concert arrangement, which is it doesn't go into the March of the Resistance, it just ends there, and that makes for an interesting little
Okay.
And that makes for an interesting little narrative arc in its own right for the Rebellion is Reborn concert piece, because that's it's on one end Rose's theme in the sort of gentle original, and it concludes in much more of a bold, right?
Yeah.
In full 4-8 horns playing it, much more heroic and decisive.
Yeah, ending on like the B flat fanfare type thing.
Yeah. So it's like going from this somewhat more naive, childish version of Rose's theme through the disillusionment of Luke and Exile's music, and emerging as this very self-possessed and assured heroic statement of Rose's theme, which you also kind of get in the movie in some ways. Like during the Battle of Crate, there's much more of a kind of traditional hero brassy theme version of Rose, which I remember correctly, it may even be in one of these end credits suites somewhere.
Rose's theme.
Yeah, Rose's theme.
Okay. What does it remind me of?
Wow.
So please read my mind. Okay. Let me just.
Okay.
I try not to linger on the music too much when I watch the movies, but some things I can't help but notice. And when I watched The Last Jedi, I could not help but notice Rose's theme everywhere, all the time, a lot. And all I could think of in my mind, and the thing is, it's like it's definitely not a quote anyway. Like it reminded me of like Stravinsky in some way. It reminded me of like, don't know why, and it might be the wrong reference. Like just something in my brain immediately thought like Firebird Suite or like, and I'm not sure if it's like a rhythm or like a turn of phrase or something like Berceuse and Finale, maybe or
Oh, I have to think about that. Like I
yeah,
have the word in my brain, but it's I have to rotate through all the different little tableaus
just
there.
something
But
in
it
the
is
something in that part.
no,
Yeah.
it has. I'd look for something that's kind of Lydian or major within this.
Yeah.
It's
Like what?
definitely plausible. I mean, it's certainly not the. It wouldn't have been the first time that Williams used referred to Stravinsky in Star Wars. But
True.
to me, I get well. People have pointed out, and I'm not sure how much is true, but it does begin with at least melodically the same few notes as the Force
Force.
theme versus
Which is also how March of the Resistance starts.
right, and that's also it's it sounds like Star Wars for that reason. I don't know
It's
that Williams was trying to say that she's force sensitive or something, but it's definitely force esque in a certain way. And then the harmony is this Lydian major modal mixture kind of vibe, which is we've heard before at least once in each trilogy with
yeah.
Anakin's theme in
And
Episode One
Yoda.
and Yoda. So it's in that lineage. And Williams has written plenty of other Lydian themes, E.T. or
Mm-hmm.
Space Camp or whatever. So it also sounds like Williams. There's a piece I heard on an album that he did with the Boston Pops, and I'm forgetting the name, but I think it was something about it was sort of like a Arbor Day or you know Greenpeace oriented music celebrating the world's trees or something by another composer that he conducted, and it was like in the 80s or 90s, and that also had a kind of something like that figure. So there's a lot that it recalls to me too. Back to the Future, actually, at one point, not in the end credits, but during the big Faviers scene when there's that cutaway to them on the beach against, I think, the moon, and it's this
Back
huge,
to the Future?
giant, yeah, it's like
Oh. Oh.
I don't know exactly the moment. Somewhere
Yeah.
I thought that sounded a little bit Sylvestrian. So
Mm-hmm.
Alan Silvestri, the Back to the Future composer,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a bit of that in one of those unused versions of Rose theme from the end credits too. So who knows? But yeah, it is a piece that is full of resonances with other music. It sounds, for that reason, I think very appropriate to Star Wars because it kind of already has a bit of other Star Wars music in it, intervallically, harmonically, which makes it such a shame also that it doesn't come back in Rise of Skywalker, but that's another
Yeah.
issue for another day, I
And that
suppose.
was all, yeah, that was the other big thing. I like that was also like the one thing I walked away from
Mhm.
Rise of Skywalker being like, Rose's theme was not in there. Why was it so?
Well,
Why bother write such a theme?
well,
But
that,
anyway,
that much I don't think you can lay on Williams' feet
oh yeah, yeah,
because
yeah.
he
I
didn't
know.
have any scenes with her to score, really.
Right, right.
So what are you gonna do?
Back to the Lydian thing with the Roses theme. I know that like wonderment is like
Mm.
a fascination of yours, and can you? How does that like? How do you see that showing up in Star Wars? And what do you mean by that? Like, well, let me just. I've been reading Hollywood Harmony, your your textbook,
Another
and
available on Amazon.
yes, link in show notes. Um, and I feel like what is the part that would make sense here? Okay. Um, I mean, you characterize like this Hollywood film music sound,
Mhm.
and you also sort of talk about its through line from late 19th century romantic tradition, but also its sort of departure in sort of by way of like really dialing in the things that used to be cherries on top,
Mhm.
right? Like chromatic, like heavy chromaticism, and um, wonderment is like a very something that you bring up a lot, and like not only in like Star Wars or in even in like the promise of film itself, like in the logos and the you know
Yeah. Oh, that's
just
another. There's some movie logos that sound kind of like Rose's theme, like the
mhm,
Universal Studios order thing. 'Cause that's also Lydian. Yeah, a way to think about it is that sort of Hollywood, in its tendency to mass produce everything, kind of mass produces this feeling of wonderment through harmony that was previously a little bit more of a special effect in,
right.
say, Wagner or Strauss or Puccini. Not that they weren't also writing music that, in its own way, had kind of mass produced or a wide appeal to it. But there's a certain form of optimization that happens in Hollywood where they you figure out the right musical trick and just repeat it until it becomes so
The
cliche.
standard.
Yeah, and then you got to sort of find something else. But with Star Wars, because these film scores are inherently kind of retrospective, even back in 1977, I mean, the very conception was for it to be a throwback score to 1930s, 40s style adventure scoring rather than the more modern, electronic, sort of avant garde, alienating music that you would have probably expected from a sci fi movie at the time. It was supposed to be very romantic and to contrast with the alienness of other stuff that was happening on screen. So in that way, you can kind of get away with having, you know, musical conventions or gestures or cliches, whatever you want to call them, that have a very long heritage and in other contexts might sound a little tired. And I think that Lydian one, it just sounds perfectly at home in these movies because yeah, there's a nice history of it being associated with wonder and sort of wide-eyed optimism and childhood, and mystery and magic that dates at least back to the mid 19th century.
Mhm. Um, wait, I think I'm no, I'm not. Along the same lines, um, since we hear Leia's theme in this set of minutes, can you talk about the relationship between, like, would the Leia's, I guess, chord progression, the associate, would that be categorized under wonderment for you or something different? Because that's also very commonly used in Star Wars, not
Yeah.
just in John Williams, but since you've been watching The Bad Batch, you also might remember that it shows up with Hera, another character very
Hmm.
similar to Leia's theme.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think all these chord progressions and harmonic relationships, they're flexible, right? And you can get sort of different qualities or valences from them depending on the context. And I think if there's something maybe that links the Leia and Hera and Jin's motif from
Mm.
um, Rogue One, I think also does this. And Kira's actually the love theme in
Oh,
Solo also has a similar kind of progression. It's more this sort of cliched progression for romantic love and feminine subjectivity as well,
okay.
um, which you can kind of hear it in Williams's musical themes for other uh, heroines and female protagonists, like Marion from Raiders of the Lost Ark. It has a kind of old-fashioned sound, and I don't think it's not. One probably would not use it to characterize musically that kind of character these days because it's a little
It's a little too on
reductive,
the
of
nose.
course.
Like
But I think that,
you're
yeah,
talking kind of like about the either like
yeah.
this or I mean this would be like sort of similar.
Hmm. I think, well, all the film music is reductive in one way or the other. So I don't know. Maybe I would take that back. But it's more that in those prior contexts, and Leia's theme, for as beautiful as it is and as useful it is as a shorthand for a character, it was initially conceived by Williams as a love theme, and
Mhm.
and a love theme specifically. This is squicky, I guess you could say, but he thought that it would be Leia and Luke as
Right.
the romantic item. So it has a kind of passionate, in some ways, erotic quality to it, and
Totally.
using.
Never-ending climax at the end.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I mean, it's
Just
positively
rises
Wagnerian.
higher and
Yeah.
higher.
I mean, yeah. It's a pretty explicit music, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
But it's
Yes.
mostly it's from the male perspective. Like if you
Yes.
were to, if you were kind of to attempt to discern a persona or a subjectivity in the music Leia's theme, like the concert arrangement. It's kind of Luke's imagination of what Leia means, rather than like this very, plucky, take no, BS from anyone princess who's really a warrior and a revolutionary in general. Um, and you can contrast this, I think, very usefully with Rose's theme and with Rey's
With
theme,
Ray's
which
theme, I think
go
is a huge
yeah,
departure.
a complete departure, yeah, and much more contemporary and
Yes.
subtle and contains a lot of different dimensions to her
Like more
character.
stoic almost, even though it does,
Hmm. Yeah.
I think that's an interesting case of like how Leia's theme initially meant as an erotic love theme.
Hmm.
Totally. It because it ended up just being for Leia, and then Han and Leia had a separate one, and then Luke and Leia had a separate theme. But
Hmm.
because in our memory now we associate the theme with Leia, this is where like separation between what is and who made
Hmm.
it comes into play. Where like I like to espouse some sense of separation at the end of the day, like because the media lives on, and
Hmm.
we don't always have the privilege of knowing exactly what was intended and like all of that stuff. So what is just sort of is. So like Leia's theme is now read as this really deep, like how cool that Leia got this
Hmm.
like, and she grew into her theme in a different way, and so it kind of changes the meaning of the
Yeah.
theme. And then I think it's really interesting how I don't know how like people like Kevin Kiner and whatnot are maybe not thinking of the original like erotic love
Hmm.
theme, but when they're kind of writing a
Hmm.
copy of Leia's theme for a new strong rebellion character, it's
A
sort of
little,
like
yeah.
separated from it has different connotations.
And well, but those connotations change too.
Yes.
It's like what would have been heard in 1977 as this kind of damsel in distress romantic promise of a romantic relationship theme is because of the popularity of Star Wars and the fact that there's so many imitators. Maybe nowadays that's really just a strong heroine chord progression. I mean, not if you know your film history necessarily, or especially your musical history, but I don't know if the average viewer of like Rebels or The Bad Batch has like Tchaikovsky Romeo and Juliet or Tristan and Isolde or Casablanca in mind when they're hearing it. They're probably
Oh my
thinking,
god.
"Oh, this is like what I heard back when I watched A New Hope, in
Yeah.
1995 on VHS or something like that." That's the point of reference, or sooner, really, or more recent. I mean, so yeah, it's
Which is
very
interesting because
tricky.
it's totally fine,
Yeah.
but it also is like a not a caution it's not a cautionary tale. Like I mean, I don't want to say that it's like a bad thing, but it is also
Mhm.
like easy to see how even within the same like lifetime we can misconstrue things and apply the things that we
Mhm.
have learned from media thinking that we know what we're doing in a different way, which again doesn't
Yeah.
mean that the result is bad. It's just really easy for intentions to get lost in translation. It's very
Mhm.
easy.
Tell me about it. That's why it serves to be dogmatic and pedantically explicit in your research, about every last detail as much as can be said.
Huh.
Um, yeah.
Oh my gosh. The only thing I remember about like studying Wagner or Tristan, other
Hmm.
than the Tristan chord, which is like, of course,
Okay.
they have to teach you that in music school. But the only thing the only thing I really remember about that whole class is that that it was like an orgasm, and that's like the only takeaway I had from that
Yeah.
piece is like
Well,
a really long orgasm, like
if you
lead up
take
to an
if you
orgasm.
if you take away one thing from the what was it 4.5 hours long music drama that is Tristan and Isolde, the prolonged orgasm in music is probably one of them. And crucially, it's not just one, but several. And the big one that occurs in Act Two is a coitus or music interruptus, where before clinching the final E major, or is it B major?
Yeah,
I can't remember. Whatever the final chord,
it's
the
really
music
funny.
disintegrates and the interlopers interlope. But at the end of the opera, finally, you get that sense of resolution. It is. orgiastic. And that kind of happens on a very small scale, compared to uh, Wagnerian opera in Leia's theme. Definitely doesn't happen um, in the sequel trilogy, though, as far as I know. There's no long, drawn out sort of
Yeah.
sensual music quite like that.
Yeah.
Much to the chagrin of Raylos everywhere, but we
Yeah.
at least got the kiss.
We did get the
Well,
kiss. We got the sad kiss.
I don't know. Maybe that says something about me that I just use the first person. I shouldn't say we. I'm not Raylo.
They got the kiss.
Yeah.
No. Okay. A couple more things that I'm going to play. I think we're going to get to the Battle of Crate section. So is this what you call resistance and trouble? I think this is when they're like running into the trenches. Oh, and then there's the Kylo Ren's theme, but with
looping in there.
Yeah. Here's the whirling octotonicism, yeah. More whirling octotonism. Which is fun to play. It's very like Rimsky-Korsakov-ish. It's like just never, it's just it's non-stop in the Battle of Crate. More of the whirling thing. There the notes change a little bit. This must be exhausting to play, but really fun. Is that tension? Resistance and trouble. Fanfare. Right. With the whirling octotonicism interplay. Ray's whole theme is very violinistic, very string friendly. All of this is. Now we're in the trench, like Star Tours. Now this reminds me of Star Tours. Yeah, I mean, this is all from the Battle of Crate. It's all so good. It's the musical equivalent of what fans would say. This is fan service.
Well, yeah, sure. Why not? I mean, if you're going to do that, do it in the end credits. And I think in at least one version of the end credits, there's Yoda's theme is interpolated in there, or have we not heard that yet?
Oh, wait. No, we have.
Yeah.
I don't think we have.
The version on the album is
like
different
fast?
than the version. Yeah, the version on the album has Yoda's theme, and the version on whatever.
Oh yeah.
DVD, Blu-ray, streaming version, I think just goes straight to the TIE Fighter attack.
Okay.
So yeah, we're dealing with a whole mishmash of music from a gigantic action set piece. And yeah, we get major themes like Ray's theme and the Rebel Phantom. We get minor ones like Resistance and Trouble, and what, for lack of better term, I just called whirling octotonicism, which
I appreciate how literal it is.
Yeah, well, I included only after Solo came out and was like, there's part of the Adventures of Han, which is very, very much in a similar vein of speedy passage work based on octotonic scales. Just great stuff. But
I have a question about your catalog now, because that's what you call. I mean, that's an incidental motif, which I mean, it hasn't been elevated to leitmotif status. It's more probably less consequential, but of course, I have the beholder. But and that to me is like that type of writing, sort of like all the tension stuff. I mean, a lot of it sounds like natural byproducts of a writing style.
Yeah.
And of course, like the line is, I mean, there is no like line of separation between what is just like something you do because it's your style versus like what can be categorized as a motif, because one comes from like the creator and one is like the beholder. So like that's fine. But like, What hap I'm very okay, you have one incidental motif that's also similar to me in that it's the octo arpeggios, just in
Hmm.
that it's like at first like it might take you a lot of times to really decide, okay, that's a
Hmm.
thing. Um and we do hear that in the end credits, right? The octo
Yeah,
arpeggios.
it's within the Luke and Exile section of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you see that as related to like the Kamino, like the mystery motif?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So
Because they're
right.
at the end of the day, it's arpeggios. Like I don't think he actually
Arpeggio.
thinks that they're a
Yeah.
theme at all. Yeah.
So yeah, there's like two things that work. One is that these are throwaway moments in the score. Generally speaking, they're not. The music isn't drawing attention to itself too much when we get ba, 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 or whatever.
Yeah.
Or perhaps even the
Whatever.
yeah. I mean, it's and so on one hand you have the music on sort of second to second level, maybe not the foreground of the mix or not prepared or departed in a way that really draws your attention to the fact that, oh, we got a big theme here, like we do with the main Luke and Exile themes, where like there's a cut and a
Hmm.
cadence and then 4 plus 4 measures worth of new melody, right? That just says, this is, pay attention to me, this is important. And on the other hand, like you mentioned, it's the materials are, not marked, they're kind of generic. Not ear catching necessarily on their own terms, like an arpeggio is something that any composer could do, or kind of syncopated single pitch, over the course of several measures. So, but then it's a question of reuse and relatedness too. So, I mean, I didn't draw the connection between the octo arpeggios and the Kamino ones, but maybe I should revisit that, especially since I think I elevated Kamino, that stuff, to the mystery motif after it was recapitulated bizarrely, but for sure
In the
did get
Rise of
recapitulated
Skywalker.
in Rise of Skywalker. Yeah, so that can happen. Um,
Well, I don't know if you
yeah.
watched the like one of the recent Bad Batch episodes, but the Kamino those
Hmm.
came
Oh, I was
back.
pleased to hear. I mean, that was like 2 or so
It was, I think it's the
seconds
most recent
of
one, episode 15.
yeah.
Yeah,
Oh yeah, yeah, and like there's a portion of it which was more or less literally recreating
yeah,
Williams' music for the
from
intro
Attack
to
of the
Camino,
Clones.
but then afterwards there was a little bit more, kinder
Hmm.
playing with it, which is that's my favorite thing to hear. It's not the literal recaps, but
Yeah,
rather like we're going to do something new with the material. Um, but that's also something that just happened to be in Williams' ear in 2002, 2003, because you can hear mysterious chromatic arpeggios in Minority Report, a score that he wrote and
right.
it came out in the same year. And Williams sort of just he becomes fixated or has this, musical shorthands for a certain mood that come and go. The tension stuff that you mentioned is like probably the the most the banner example, since you hear some version of in every Star Wars sequel movie, but also pretty much every Williams movie since 1999 or 2000. At least every Williams movie that includes an action scene.
Hmm.
It's just a motif that's on his mind.
And it's sort of like a
Um,
DS era.
oh yeah, yeah.
you can hidden Mickey that anywhere.
Hmm. Well, there was a version of my catalog at one point that had the DSE ray as a leitmotif, and then I figured, okay, this is no, that it doesn't have enough individuality
Yeah.
to it to assume that importance. But there are themes that feature the DSE ray, like the sort of Anakin's descent music, that integrated into it. But back to tension, I think in Last Jedi, and it's here in the end credits at one point. It's the fact that there is this kind of story that he tells with that
Hmm.
otherwise very generic, you know. I mean, that ends up getting us. Yeah, in some ways, the musical climax of the movie, or at least
Right.
the
So
most
we're
audience,
going back to the part where
on your edge
Holdo
of your seat.
maneuver.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it very much in that case, it does need to get promoted from incidental to something that is accumulating meaning. It may have humble, even accidental origins, but man, by the time that you get that theme, it's very much a theme proper. It's not just some little,
Yes.
relegated to a second portion of my catalog where all the like the runty little motifs go.
If anyone wants to know more about that, listen to the episode of the show called Hold Those Resolve, in which I attempt to present what you
Yeah.
um, talk about in one of your lectures, which is like the development of the tension motif to this, teleological like instance of
Mhm.
this. Yeah, like
Can I
it's
just
interesting.
say, I gave that talk. I was like, I think it was in 2019, and that is the highlight of my career. Being able to essentially nerd out, before my professional society with the most insidery, like not trivial, because this actually I think is
Yeah.
interesting material, but it's so like it's so nerdy, and but it was well received too. So
Yeah.
everything's downhill since I just discussed the
That
tension
was extremely
desperation
cool.
theme.
That was really
Mhm.
cool. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. So, yeah, I recommend people watch that. they, it might be kind of hard to understand if,
Yeah,
depending on your background, but still, I think
yeah.
it's very interesting. Um,
If you want to see how far you can go, like intellectually, but also professionally with this kind of analysis, I think that's the apex. It doesn't get more geeky than that.
well, I guess the lead line would be that despite what one could say about the sequel music compared to the other, the evolution of John Williams' style somewhat and whatever, the new demands of these films in this
Mhm.
era versus old films, like it is cool to see that there is actually something n- newly unique um, formally that is happening in this score.
It
And
really
I
is.
think that
Yeah.
is like a cool takeaway. And it's cool that like, I like to think about what powers were in place that made it possible for this to happen because it's not always like, oh,
Mhm.
John Williams has never wanted to do it before. Like, that's probably not true, but it might be
Well,
true. But,
it has something to do with the more visionary aspects, I think, of the screenwriting and directing, right? The fact that we have this rather risky scene, risky as you can tell because there's a backlash against, against the plot device, I guess, of hyperspace
ram it. Yeah. Jump. Yeah.
ramming.
That whole thing.
What I mean, whatever.
Whatever.
But
Whatever.
it is, visually and in terms of the form of the movie, like it's very striking, and I think Williams was a little bit inspired by that, and inspired by the assuredness of the storytelling in cases like that to maybe experiment and do something that he hadn't done elsewhere.
And indeed, that desperation does not show up in The Rise of Skywalker.
No, well,
Or does
no,
it?
not that. Yeah, that no, that again, as far as I know, because
Okay.
there's
Okay.
how many hours of Rise of Skywalker music we haven't
Sure.
heard yet. But the theme proper does not. No, you
And the
hear it
theme
at the end.
proper doesn't happen in the rest of The Last Jedi, which is very
There's a
interesting
there's a nod to it.
in the crate.
Um, it's on board when uh, Phasma is, I think, coming out or something. Like at the
Oh,
beginning
okay.
of
Okay.
the thing, there's a snatch of it. Everything's on fire. It's immediately after the bisection of whatever that gigantic star destroyer
Hmm.
the supremacy is. So it's like right on the heels, but yeah, it's
Yeah.
otherwise
But it doesn't show up in
outgoing.
the Battle of Crate,
No,
which is in, which
yeah,
maybe is
even more
significant,
desperate.
maybe not. But like the way I think about it is like if you're gonna kill off a motif, like it happened with like this very grim, like sacrificing like Holdo and the Radis. They've been killed
Mhm.
off, and this motif that has developed went down with the ship.
Yeah, yeah. What else is there to do? I mean, it's gone. It
Yeah.
served its purpose, and boy, does it have a send off, right? That it's one of the. I'm happy that it's also you get to hear it in the end credits too, right? It recurs. Williams, I think, realized that this was a highlight.
Yeah. That's really cool. Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, there are too many things that we could continue talking about. Would you be up to come back on the show sometime?
It would be my pleasure. I think we're alike in that you and I can both talk about this kind of stuff for hours,
Forever.
and there's no
Yes.
activity we'd rather do.
Yep.
So,
But you made a career out of it. I made a podcast about it. Just an
Yeah,
excuse to
well,
do it.
you're probably reaching more people though. Quite honestly,
No,
like
no,
I have
no.
a pretty. It means a lot that anyone responds to the effort that you put into this kind of work, because at the end of the day, like it is pretty. This kind of analysis can get somewhat abstract and esoteric, even with such a phenomenally popular property like Star Wars. So anytime that I hear that someone else has like looked at my catalog or read an article, it means a lot. I think it does to everyone.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear that. But of course, you provide such a great resource. And I think it's great that you are also engage with, I mean, not necessarily directly like at school, but sometimes at school because you teach non-musicians too, but
Mhm.
with people of different backgrounds, because it is like
Yeah.
also just so important that, everyone is invited to the table of these conversations.
And that's how this music is going to persist if it does. That it's not just um, you know restrained to a little bubble of academics or connoisseurs or super fans, but we can kind of share in a way that speaks to people who have their own sort of musical knowledge and intuitions and experiences. Again, that's the great thing about film music, is that at least we're all coming to the same table with certain previous experiences for the most part. I mean, this
Yeah.
is a different time than it was in 1977, but a lot of the same needs for film music are persisting. And
It is the dynamic world we're living in.
that, yeah,
Yeah,
that's for
there's a
sure.
lot
Musically, as
happening.
much as everything else. Goodness
Oh
gracious.
yes, that's a whole other episode.
What
So
what a privilege it is for you and me to be able to talk about this stuff.
totally.
Shut out everything else and enjoy this aesthetic pleasure. I mean, there are responsibilities and cultural obligations we also have, but
Well, let me
it's
just
just
say
love
that I think it's like
music.
I think it transcends like an aesthetic pleasure. I mean, I think the point of talking about it isn't to actually learn about the music. It's
Hmm.
sort of to learn like I think music analysis and discussions are for everyone because learning about how we are interpreting music just teaches us about ourselves. Like that's at the end of the day, like that's what in doing this work, that's what I'm
Hmm.
constantly struck with. Is like I realize some of my biases, I realize like what I love, like I realize what I'm primed to hear, and by talking to people with different perspectives, I'm like I
Yeah.
it's it just really is it's like I don't know, some form of therapy or whatever people do
Hmm.
to learn more about themselves. It's self-discovery just through the medium of music and through the lens of talking about Star Wars music.
Hmm.
At the end of the day, we're learning about ourselves.
Yeah. Psychoanalysis via film music. I love it.
Yeah. Where can people find you online?
People can find me online at franklehman.com. That's where the semi-permanent home of the catalog exists. I'm also off and on active on Twitter at FM Lehman, and not Wikipedia so much though. If you're looking
Really?
for, well, yeah, it's a that. Well, maybe it's another topic for another day. But the
You mean like
Star Wars music
oh,
Wikipedia
oh, I
entry.
thought you
No,
meant
no,
like
no,
having
yeah.
a page for
Oh
you.
no, no,
I'm like,
nothing.
I'm sure someone can
Yeah,
create a page for you, Frank.
it's just so resentful. No, no, I'm talking about
Oh gosh,
my.
don't get me started on that.
I'm not an editor. I tried once recently to add some of my own references, and then it was like removed because
I've
it was
made one.
obviously self promotion.
Oh my god.
It's a tough world to enter, and I'm just gonna
Wikipedia is a
keep
whole
on
thing.
doing stuff from now on,
Let
autonomously.
me just also say the reason I asked you about the mystery motif is because Wikipedia has an article on it,
Yes, Wikipedia. I love Wikipedia.
and
Not an editor though.
it is very interesting to look at it
Oh.
because um, what has occurred is it seems like there are a ton there. It's like basically the mystery motif shows up everywhere, and there's all these examples, and I've checked out
Hmm.
all the examples, and it's mostly like instances of arpeggios.
Yeah,
So that
that's
yeah,
where you want someone with a little bit more musicological expertise
so
to
it's just
to filter
interesting.
out. Yeah,
But
that's interesting.
it's interesting. It's
Yeah,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
Also, I'll say on Wikipedia, I've written one Wikipedia article, and that is on Haydn's Opus 76 string quartets.
Whoa! Well, that's one more than I have.
And I'll never
Congratulations.
do it again.
Yeah.
So, weirdest
Amazing.
plug I've done on the show so far. And I
Yeah.
gain nothing from it except you can see how embarrassing it is. All right.
Well, maybe you'll have to do a Haydn minute podcast
Ugh,
after this,
I
where you go
don't
through
think
all of
that's
those symphonies and all of those
I don't think
string
that's for me.
quartets one at a
I
time.
don't think that's for me. But Haydn is underrated. Anyway, so if anyone has questions for me or for Frank, since there will be a future episode, he has given me his word on this show, so he's now beholden to it. Then I can start collect them for, I don't know, whenever, later this year, next year, that he comes back. And there's only one episode left of this season. I'm very excited, and what can I say? I don't want to get sappy, but it's been a really fun season. We are now almost at the end of The Last Jedi, and if you have any lingering thoughts that you want to sprinkle in there about The Last Jedi, the music, the film, you can email me at podcast@starwarsmusicminute.com or tweet me at starwarsmusmin. And also other places. Where am I? I'm on YouTube and all the podcasting platforms. That's about it. Yeah. I'm bad at these plugs. Damn. Okay. Well, I'll see you last week. Jesus. I'll see you last week. Great. I'll see you next week for the final episode of Star Wars Music Minute, Last Jedi season. May the Force be with you.